Cron jobs can be a confusing concept to beginner developers out there, but it's quite simple. A cron job is a task or script that is performed at a certain time. This can be performed once, daily, monthly, or even every hour. It's up to you. Basically, it's an automated task. A lot of servers come with cron jobs built in. All you have to do is tell the server what script to execute and when to execute it. WordPress has a cron job task manager built in. We want to set up a cron job that will run once a day. This cron job will pick a random recipe and use it as the recipe of the day. We're going to schedule our cron job in the activation file. Open that file and at the bottom of the function, call WP schedule event function. I'll provide a link in the resource section of this lecture for this function. This function has 3 parameters. The first parameter is the first time this event will occur. We want to run this right away, so we'll pass in the current time. The second parameter is the recurrence. When will this function run again? We are given 3 recurrence options: hourly, twice daily, and daily. We want daily. You can set up your own custom recurrence, but we won't be covering that in this lecture. The last parameter is the hook that will be triggered. Notice that I say hook and not function. WordPress will create a custom action hook for you that you can then hook into yourself. Other plugins can also hook into this event as well. I'm going to call this hook our daily recipe hook. WordPress will schedule this cron job upon activating the plugin. However, I do not want you to deactivate and reactivate the plugin just yet. We can now use this hook like any other action hook. Inside the plugin file, add our new custom hook, and the function we'll call is our generate daily recipe. This hook is triggered once daily. WordPress will take care of checking the time and calling this hook for you. Next, let's create a file inside the includes folder and call it cron.php. Define the function here. Include this file from the main plugin file. This function will run once a day at the beginning of the day. WordPress cron jobs aren't perfect. Unlike regular cron jobs, WordPress cron jobs won't run exactly at the same time every day. WordPress depends on a user visiting the site to check for scheduled events. For example, our cron job will run once a day at the beginning of the day. Let's say we don't get any traffic at the beginning of the day. If the first visit is 4 hours after the beginning of the day, then our cron job will run at that time. This is very important to know. WordPress cron jobs are not actual Unix cron jobs. We're almost done. Cron jobs are managed by you, the developer. So it's important to know how to manage all your cron jobs. Too many cron jobs can lead to slow performance. If we were to uninstall or deactivate the plugin, our cron job would still be active. WordPress does not deactivate cron jobs even if your plugin is inactive. We have to unschedule this cron job upon deactivation. There's a special hook called register deactivation hook. It works just like its opposite activation hook. We have to pass in the main plugin file followed by the name of the function to call upon deactivation. The function will be called rDeactivatePlugin. Let's create a file called deactivate.php inside the includes folder. This will contain the deactivation plugin. Include this file from the main plugin file. To unschedule an event, we need to use the WP clear scheduled hook function. This function has one parameter, which is the name of the hook. In our case, this would be our daily recipe hook. That's it. We can now safely deactivate and reactivate our plugin knowing that we'll only have one cron job running at a time. We can now begin generating a random recipe of the day. To accomplish this task, we'll begin by using the Transients API. The Transients API is an API that allows us to store data for a certain amount of time. You can think of this as a cookie or session, except the data is meant for the server and not the client. It's exactly like the Options API, but with an expiration date. By default, the Transients API will store the data in the database. To be specific, it'll store the data inside the WP options table. The purpose of the Transients API is to have your data readily available. This can increase performance. However, here's the problem. Since the data is stored in the database, then the response times will be similar if you didn't use the Transients API. The great thing about the Transients API is that a lot of its functionality can be overwritten. We won't be exploring how to do that because that kind of stuff is handled by other plugins. 99% of the time you'll be working on a site that has a cache plugin installed, or you'll end up installing one anyway. Most cache plugins, or at least the better ones, will override its functionality. Rather than saving your data in the database, it'll save the data in memory. Data stored in memory can be retrieved faster, therefore increase performance. The problem with storing data in memory is that the data is not persistent. That means that if the server was to unexpectedly shut down, then any data would be lost. You shouldn't store any important or sensitive data in memory. For our case, storing the recipe of the day will work just fine. Even if the data gets lost, the cron job will end up storing another recipe of the day. This is why we're using the Transients API. Currently, the data will get saved in the database. We won't be able to see the benefits of using the Transients API, but on a production server we will, assuming you also install a third-party cache plugin. Inside the cron function, we're going to query the database for a random recipe. We'll be using this query in multiple locations, so it would be ideal to place this code into its own function that we can call later on. Inside the includes folder, create a file named utility.php. We'll be placing any custom reusable functions here. Sometimes you'll have stuff like that, so it's always good practice to place those functions in a file like this. Include this file from the main plugin file. Inside the utility file, we're going to define a function called rGetRandomRecipe. Inside this, we're going to need the global WPDB object. Then, we're going to make a query for a recipe ID. Let me break down this query. We only want the post ID from the posts table. The WPDB object provides a posts property that contains the name of the posts table name. Next, we want to make sure we only grab published posts and posts with the post type of recipe. Lastly, we want to order the results randomly using the random MySQL function and limit the result to 1. This query actually performs slow. There are a lot of examples out there that will generate a random row faster. However, this query only runs once a day, so it won't really stress the server. Because of that, this query will work just fine for our purposes. We are returning the result of this query. The last step is to set the transient. Switch back to the cron function. We will use a function called setTransient. In the resource section of this lecture, you'll find a link to the Transients API codex page. This function has 3 parameters. The first is the name of our transient. I'm going to call this rDailyRecipe. The second parameter is the value. This can be anything we want. You don't have to worry about sanitizing this value, as WordPress will sanitize it for us. I'm going to call the rGetRandomRecipe function. Lastly, we have to set an expiration time. The recipe should only last for a day. The time must be in seconds. We could do the math and figure out how many seconds are in a day, but WordPress provides a constant for this. On the Transients API documentation page, you'll find this section called Using Time Constants. Here you'll find a couple of constants that WordPress creates for you that contain how many seconds are in an hour, day, week, month, etc. The constant day in seconds contains how many seconds are in a day. Pass this constant in as the third parameter to the setTransient function. That's it. We now have a random recipe of the day. We'll get the same recipe every day since we only have published one recipe. You'll have to reactivate the plugin again for this to take effect. We can now display the recipe of the day inside the widget. Back inside the widget method, we are passed 2 variables named arguments and instance. Let's use the extract function to convert these two variables from arrays to single variables. This isn't required, but it makes it easier to read our code when using widgets. One of the variables extracted is called title. We will want to filter the title by using the apply filters function. This function will trigger a filter hook. The hook we want to trigger is called widget title. The second parameter for this function is the data we want to pass onto this hook. Keep in mind that filters will return a filtered value. Therefore, we'll want to store the value. Any plugin that wants to filter the title of our widgets can now do so, including us. We're going to echo out some variables provided by the arguments array. The before widget is the HTML before every widget. The before title is the HTML before the title. You'll notice that the names used here correspond to the keys for register sidebar function. I'm going to open the widgets file inside the theme we created earlier. These 4 keys are the actual values for the variables we just used. Every theme will have different HTML, but since we're using our own custom theme, we'll know the values of these variables. Continuing on, we'll want to append the title and then echo out the after title. We don't have to worry about the HTML. Styling is up to the theme. Next, we echo out the after widget to close up everything. Before the after widget, we want to echo out the recipe of the day along with a link to it. Let's grab the transient that contains the ID. We can grab the transient we created earlier by using the getTransient function. We pass in the name of the transient we want to grab. This would be our daily recipe. Sometimes the transient may not work. This could be due to a failed cron job or failed query. If that happens, we'll want to create a backup. I'm going to create a conditional statement checking if the recipe ID is empty. If it is, I'm going to create a new recipe ID using the rGetRandomRecipe function. I'll also update the transient using the setTransient function with the new value. The next step is to render the HTML. I'm going to grab the HTML from the static template and paste it in here. Now all we have to do is take the time to convert it into a dynamic template. This is nothing you haven't done before. I'm going to replace the links with the getPermalink function and pass in the recipe ID. Then I'm going to echo out the title. Lastly, I'm going to use the post thumbnail. That's about it. Let's check if everything works. Go to the homepage of our site and refresh. It seems like everything is working perfectly. We can click on this recipe and view the recipe of the day. After you've confirmed everything works, you can finally move on to the next lecture. That was a lot to do, but it was well worth the effort. Hopefully you understand how to create widgets, transients, and cron jobs.